Hello there. So it's Thursday and I'm back on my Talk to Joe page to talk about self-acceptance and why it can be really quite difficult to accept ourselves. And I'm writing a blog about this at the moment, and you can find my blogs at thegoodenoughmum.com/blog, and you'll see that I'll be publishing something about this subject in the next couple of days. So self-acceptance, why is it so difficult? I certainly struggled with self-acceptance when I was younger, and it's taken me a long time really to be able to be okay with who I am as a person. And I'd like to share sort of why that's difficult and the things that have helped me to get more to a place where I can be myself and be okay with being myself. So I read a really useful blog yesterday all about something called introjection. And it's a sort of psychological term that we use. And introjection is where we take on the thoughts about ourselves that perhaps we think other people are thinking about us. And this can start at a really useful age. And I'd like to tell the story that the blog tells, because it sort of illustrates the process of what can happen. And so it said, imagine that Sam is a 4-year-old boy who has been learning how to dress himself. And one morning his mum says to him, now hurry up, go and get yourself dressed. We're going out. You can choose your best clothes, put them on, and then we'll be going out. So Sam runs upstairs and he's really excited because he's going to choose his clothes for the first time, and he can choose his best clothes. So he puts on his brightest shirt and his best pair of blue jeans, and he runs downstairs to his mother, who turns round and has a sort of look of disgust on her face and says, that's no good, go upstairs and get changed. So he runs upstairs and he just feels really dejected and thinks that he's useless, and actually he can't dress very well, and he can't choose his own clothes. So he takes his clothes off and he sits there and he waits for his mummy to come and dress him, because obviously he's no good at choosing clothes himself. And then mummy comes upstairs and she's even crosser because he's not even dressed now. And he sees her face and he feels like, mummy thinks I'm stupid. And what we don't know is that mummy is planning to go out for lunch with a couple of her single friends who don't have children. She's worried about how Sam's going to look to them, and she felt fairly embarrassed when she came down and he was dressed in his cowboy outfit. And also the babysitter's cancelled, and so they're going to be in even more of a rush now than she thought. And basically she's just really stressed. And of course Sam doesn't really understand any of this. All he knows is that mummy was cross with him and he takes it personally. And part of why that would be is that as children we are very, very dependent on our parents to look after us, and we fear abandonment and we need to please our parents. And what we see our parents demonstrating, they don't have to say anything, it can be with their faces, and we can see pleasure or displeasure in them, and we tend to take that into our identity. And we can very quickly, if it's sort of like those sorts of incidents happen again and again, we begin to build up this identity that we aren't very good. And the other thing that can happen is there's so much out there about sort of encouraging us to be good, such as, children are asked to go and kiss usually elderly people who they don't really know very well. And they have to sort of overcome that sort of dislike of actually kissing somebody they don't know, because that's what they've been told they've got to do. And that's being a good boy or a good girl, and being a good boy or a good girl in all sorts of ways. That's just one example. But in all sorts of ways, we're told this is how we have to be good. So, we push over a child at playgroup and we're told that that was naughty, and we've got to go and say sorry, even though we don't feel sorry. We begin to override our emotions and begin to take on what is considered to be good behaviour. And also it can begin to seem to us that we're naughty, and so we're building up this sort of internal picture of ourselves that we're naughty, and unless we're good, we're not acceptable. And we begin to sort of think that being good is the only way to be acceptable. And so inevitably, when we do make mistakes, we can actually begin to think that we're unworthy of love, we're unworthy of acceptance. And it's really difficult for us to actually live with ourselves. And this is where our lack of self-acceptance comes in. And Carl Rogers has got this lovely quote. I've used that at the top of my blog, which, to be honest, I struggle to remember. But he said the curious paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then change happens really quickly. And it is a paradox, but if we're able to let go of all those notions of what we have to be in order to be acceptable to people, if we can let go of those ideas of, if we can make a distinction between sort of socially correct behaviour and what's good, if we can make a distinction between those, we don't then have to be good in order to be acceptable. We might do socially correct things, but that's not necessarily talking about being good, because the fact is that we are actually enough in who we are. And I think there's the aspect of this that I've found so helpful in my own growth and development, I think, is knowing that, you know, we are human. We have what Paul Gilbert, who writes about the compassionate mind, calls tricky brains, whereby a lot of our threat systems react before our conscious brains are engaged. That is just the way the brain works. You know, for an example would be is that if you touch something hot, you will remove your hand before you even realise that that thing was hot, before it enters your conscious brain, because at a very quick level, at a lower part of our brain, our bodies are reacting, and that's before the message gets to our conscious brains. And when we're responding to threat, we can behave in ways that actually our conscious brains, if it had a chance to think, might stop us from doing. And so we can react in ways where that threat system takes over, and afterwards we can think, oh my God, you know, why did I do that? And it's really important, I think, to recognise that that is part of the human condition. We do have tricky brains. And Paul Gilbert says, you know, it's not our fault, but we do have a responsibility. And I think in recognising that the way we are is not our fault, it's a result of our tricky brain, it's maybe a result of perhaps the stressful situations that our own parents were under, and perhaps the difficult circumstances that they were brought up in. Perhaps they hadn't been able to resolve things from their childhood, and that sort of transmitted into us. So we were not in control of those things, but what we are in control of is our, I suppose, you know, how we choose to deal with ourselves in this moment. And part of that is about, you know, allowing ourselves to recognise that we are human. And it's really important to sort of try and think of things like, how would your best friend approach you in this situation when you've done something that you don't feel very happy about? You know, if you can imagine the kindest, wisest person that you know, and how would they respond to you in this situation? And if you can begin to imagine that sort of compassionate mind, that often helps us to recognise that truly we were trying our best. We may have mucked it up. We may have hurt people, but it wasn't our intention. And we can begin also to do something which Paul Gilbert calls mentalising, which is imagining how it feels for the other person as well. So in that little example I gave at the beginning with Sam and his mum, I mean, obviously Sam at 4 years old isn't able to mentalise what was happening to his mum in that situation. But perhaps when he's older, if he remembers that incident, he'd be able to look back and he'd be able to recognise that his mum is just a person, just as vulnerable as he was. And you know, that she was stressed out, the thought of meeting her friends, and, you know, she wanted to impress them because she wasn't feeling very confident herself. That's the sort of process of mentalising. And I think it's really helpful if, whatever situation we're in, even if we can, you know, if we're treated badly by people, to sort of try and imagine what was going on for them in that moment and what made them behave in that sort of way, and what the influences are on them. And we really don't know often what has gone on in people's lives. We really don't understand the pain and suffering that they've experienced. And that's usually where difficult behaviour comes from. And it's where our difficult behaviour comes from as well. And it's so helpful, I think, to hold that in mind, because that really helps us with self-acceptance, is to think, you know, yeah, I didn't choose the circumstances, I didn't choose my parents. I have to say, I do have lovely parents. But, you know, we didn't choose the situations that we were born into. We didn't choose the school we went to or the children we interacted with. We didn't choose the bullying, whatever. Those things happen to us. But we don't need to stay in a place of being like a victim to those circumstances. We can actually now exercise a choice as to how we want to respond to those situations. And sometimes it's actually really helpful to talk through, especially if we've been very hurt by circumstances in our lives. You know, they're not often not our doing, but then what tends to happen is when we've been hurt by circumstances, because we're hurt, we go out and we do hurtful things. And it can be really helpful to talk that through. And that's why I work as a counsellor, to give people the opportunity to talk about this sort of stuff and to be able to go over these things and to understand what was going on, both for them and for the people around them. And so that they can learn to live with whatever happened to them and whatever they did, and where necessary to try and make a difference to their lives. So if that's spoken to you at all and you want to talk to me about it, I do offer face-to-face counselling in Southend. I do have space available, and if you'd like to see me and have a chance to talk about these sorts of things, you'd be more than welcome to get in touch with me. It is all completely confidential, unless, of course, there's a risk of something like harm to children. So, you know, and obviously we can talk through that. You know the limits of confidentiality. If you want to contact me via Facebook, you're very welcome to do so. Obviously the conversations aren't shared with anybody else. It's just me that has access to my Facebook page, and we can talk a little bit if you'd like to know more about it. But just in finishing as well, I'd like to say I talk a bit more about this on my blog, thegoodenoughmum.com/blog, and that will be coming out. I think I'll finish it today, and if you're on the email list, you'll be getting it tomorrow if all goes well. But please do visit that website and have a look at the blogs, because they expand a little bit on what I'm saying. So I can see someone's just joined me. I'm sorry, I'm just about to finish, but you can catch me on the replay, and thanks for joining me. And I'll see you next week, either on Tuesday at 9:15 on the Good Enough Mum business page, or here at Talk to Joe business page at 9:15 on Thursdays. And you're very welcome to join me then. Bye.